Chapter 34, America and World War II. What was the argument made by the U.S. to get Germany first, going after Japan? Never before have we had so little time in which to do so much. The United States was plunged into the inferno of World War II with the most stupefying and humiliating military defeat in its history. In the dismal months that ensued, the democratic world teetered on the edge of disaster. Japan's fanatics forgot that whoever stabs a king must stab to kill. A wounded but still potent American giant pulled itself out of the mud of Pearl Harbor, grimly determining to avenge the bloody treachery. "Get Japan first," was a cry that rose from millions of infuriated Americans, especially on the Pacific coast. These outraged souls regarded America's share in the global conflict as a private war of vengeance in the Pacific, with the European front a kind of holding operation. But Washington, in the so-called ABC-1 agreement with the British, had earlier and wisely adopted a grand strategy of getting Germany first. If America diverted its main strength to the Pacific, Hitler might crush both the Soviet Union and Britain, then emerge unconquerable fortress in Europe. But if Germany was knocked out first, the combined Allied forces could be concentrated on Japan, and its daring game of conquest would be up. Meanwhile, just enough American strength would be sent into the Pacific to prevent Japan from digging in too deeply. So the reason why they wanted to go ahead and attack Germany first was because the United States feared that if Germany were to defeat Great Britain and also Russia or the Soviet Union, then they'd be left alone to fight two forces. So the reason why would then be, of course, to stop Hitler. The Get Germany First was the solid foundation of which all American military strategy was built, but it encountered much ignorant criticism from two-fisted Americans who thirsted for revenge against Japan. Aggrieved protests were also registered by shorthand American commanders in the Pacific and by Chinese and Australian allies. But President Roosevelt, a competent strategist in his own right, wisely resisted these pressures. Many people wanted the Americans to go against Japan first, and the reason being is, emotionally, they're still very distraught from the events of Pearl Harbor. So there were many critics of Roosevelt. However, Roosevelt, a strategist of his own, comprised a great plan to go ahead and attack Germany first. So we went ahead and answered that. So the next questions we want to answer is discuss the executive order of 9066. What was the outcome of Korematsu versus U.S.? And what did the U.S. government do in 1988 in response to Japanese internment? .1, the Allies trade space for time. I'm going to skip this section. 34.2, the shock of war. National unity was no worry thanks to the electrifying blow by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. American communists had denounced the Anglo-French imperialist war before Hitler attacked Stalin in 1941, but they now clamored for an unmitigated assault on the Axis powers. So you're even getting people that had that were far left, that they were against the war, but now they support the war. The handful of strutting pro-Hitlerites in the United States melted away, while millions of Italian and German Americans loyally supported the nation's war program. In contrast to World War I, when the patriotism of millions of immigrants was hotly questioned, World War II actually speeded the assimilation of many ethnic groups into American society. Immigration had been choked off for almost 2 decades before 1941, and America's ethnic communities were now composed of well-mettled members whose votes were crucial to Franklin Roosevelt's Democratic Party. Consequently, there was virtually no government witch hunting of minority groups as had happened in World War I. So during this time frame, you're getting a lot of Europeans that are assimilating to the American identity. This was different compared to World War I. A painful exception was the plight of some 110,000 Japanese Americans concentrated on the Pacific coast. The Washington top command feared they might act as saboteurs for Japan in case of invasion. Forcibly herded them together in concentration camps, though about 2/3 of them were American-born citizens. This brutal precaution, authorized under Executive Order 9066, was both unnecessary and unfair, as the loyalty and combat record of Japanese Americans proved to be admirable. But a wave of post-Pearl Harbor hysteria, backed by long historical swell of anti-Japanese prejudice on the West Coast, temporarily robbed many Americans of their good sense and their sense of justice. The internment camps deprived these uprooted Americans of dignity and basic rights. The internees also lost hundreds of millions of dollars in property and foregone earnings. The wartime Supreme Court in 1944 upheld the constitutionality of the Japanese relocation in Korematsu versus U.S. But more than 4 decades later, in 1988, the U.S. government officially apologized for its action and approved the payment of reparations of $20,000 to each camp survivor. So, going back to these questions that we have here, discuss Executive Order 9066. Executive Order 9066 is very important because this was signed by Roosevelt, and it authorized the Secretary of War to designate military zones and to put the Japanese Americans into concentration camps or internment camps. The reason why they were put in these camps is although many of these American or Japanese citizens were born in America, their patriotism was questioned, and there was fear that they had been spies, which might lead to further disasters and acts of terrorism, such as Pearl Harbor. What you want to know is that you're going to get the Supreme Court case here, where you're getting Korematsu versus U.S. That's looking at whether or not this was constitutional. And in 1944, the Supreme Court rules that this is constitutional for Japanese relocation. It is not a violation of their civil rights. However, 1988, decades later, they realized that this was unconstitutional, and there were reparations paid of $20,000 to each camp survivor. Those $20,000, although it might seem like a lot of money, it really isn't, considering you're looking at millions of dollars lost in property, takings as well as foregone earnings. So, if, for example, if you were a Japanese American during this time, you would have lost your homes, you would have lost all of your furniture, any traditional things that were passed down, all that was gone. So I would recommend going through these sources. The very success of the Japanese proved a lightning rod. The war prompted other changes in American mood. Many programs of the once popular New Deal, including the CCC, the WPA, and the NYA, were wiped out by the Conservative Congress elected in 1942. Roosevelt declared in 1943 that Dr. New Deal was going to retirement to be replaced by Dr. Win the War. His announcements acknowledged that not only the urgency of the war effort, but the power of the revitalized conservative forces in the country. The era of New Deal reform was now over. World War II was no idealistic crusade, as World War I had been. The Washington government did make up some effort to propagandize at home and abroad with the Atlantic Charter, but the accent was on action. Opinion polls in 1942 revealed that 9 out of 10 Americans could cite no provisions of the Atlantic Charter. A majority then, and near majority 2 years later, confessed to having no clear idea what the war was about. All Americans knew was that they had a dirty job on their hands. The only way out was forward. They went about their bloody task with astonishing efficiency. All in all, what you understand here is the New Deal is over. You're getting a more conservative Congress, and all efforts are now put on ending the war, winning the war. Building the war machine. So I did answer all of these questions. What did the government do in 1988 in response to Japanese internment? Of course, they apologized and they gave $20,000 in reparations. What was the outcome of Korematsu versus U.S.? They ruled that the Executive Order 9066, the internment of Japanese American camps, that it was constitutional. Okay? Building up the war machine. What was the purposes of the War Production Board, Office of Price Administration, National War Labor Board? The war crisis caused the drooping American economy to snap attention. Massive military orders, over $100 billion in 1942 alone, almost instantly soak up the idle industrial capacity of the still lingering Great Depression. Orchestrated by the War Production Board, American factories poured forth an avalanche of weaponry. 40 billion bullets, 300,000 aircraft, 76,000 ships, 86,000 tanks, and 2.6 million machine guns. Miracle Man shipbuilder Henry J. Kaiser was dubbed Sir Lancelot for his prodigies of ship construction. One of his ships was fully assembled in 14 days, complete with life jackets and coat hangers. So the WPB, the War Productions Board, this was very important because established in 1942, and it was to allocate raw materials and maximize a nation's war machine, right? So what you're getting here is the economy is now geared towards the war effort. The War Production Board halted the manufacture of non-essential items such as passenger cars. It assigned priorities for transportation and access to raw materials. When the Japanese invasion of British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies snapped Americans' lifeline of natural rubber, the government imposed a national speed limit and gasoline rationing in order to conserve rubber and build 51 synthetic rubber plants. By the war's end, they were far outproducing the pre-war supply. So WPB was in many ways just regulating the American economy to ensure that factories were focused on essential war items. Farmers too rolled up their sleeves and increased their output. The armed forces drained the farms of workers. But heavy new installment agricultural machinery and improved fertilizers more than made up the difference. In 1944 and 1945, blue jean farmers hauled in record-breaking billion-bushel wheat harvest. These wonders of production also brought economic strains. Full employment and scarce consumer goods fueled a sharp inflationary surge in 1942. The Office of Price Administration eventually brought ascending prices under control with extensive regulations. Rationing held down the consumption of critical goods such as meat and butter. Through some black marketeers and meatleggers cheated the system. The National War Labor Board imposed ceilings on wage increases. So what you want to understand is during this time, the government was played a crucial role in the economy through the OPA, which regulated prices. And then you're also looking at the NWLB, which made sure that they put ceilings on wages. Labor unions, whose membership grew about 10 million to more than 13 million workers during the war, fiercely resented the government-dictated wage ceilings. Despite the no-strike pledges of most of the major unions, a rash of labor walkouts plagued the war effort. Prominent among the strikers were United Mine Workers, who several times were called off the job by the crusty and iron-willed chieftain John L. Lewis. So you're getting, of course, labor unions are not happy with some of these regulations. Threats of lost production through strikes became so worrisome that Congress, in June 1943, passed the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act. This act authorized the federal government to seize and operate tied-up industries. Strikes against any government-operated industry were made a criminal offense. Under the act, Washington took over the coal mines, and for a brief period, the railroads. Yet work stoppages, although dangerous, actually counted for less than 1% of the total working hours of the United States. Wartime laboring, a record better than blockaded Britain's American workers as a whole, were commendably committed to the war effort. So, let's go back to our questions. What was the purpose of the following? The War Production Board, as stated, this centered the economic production of certain goods specifically, or certain companies specifically on the war. So they restricted the production of certain things like passenger cars, because that should be going towards the war effort. Other examples were rubber, right? Speed limits were put up to save gasoline, right? And also save rubber for tires. Office of Price Administration, they regulated prices on certain goods, right, to bring some form of economic stability during this time and also to hinder inflation. The NWL, the National War Labor Board, this is very important because what this did was this regulated wages. This regulated wages because too high of wages would, of course, hinder the war effort and cause a little bit of economic instability. It would also lead to more unemployment. Of course, labor unions were not happy with this at all. What was the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act and why was it passed? What this act did was it basically that labor strikes would it passed amidst worries about the effects that labor strikes would have on war production. So this allowed the federal government to seize and operate plants that were threatened by labor disputes. So it basically stopped any strikes that were going to hinder the war effort. Okay. Manpower and women power. What impact did Mexican immigrants have upon the war production? The Bracero program. And who was Rosie the Riveter? The armed service enlisted nearly 15 million men in World War II and some 216,000 women who were employed for non-combat duties. Best known of these women in arms were WAC, Waves, and SPARS. As a draft net was tightened after Pearl Harbor, millions of young men were plucked from their homes and clothed in the GI, government-issued outfits. As the arsenal of democracy, the United States exempted certain key categories of industrial and agricultural workers from the draft in order to keep its mighty industrial and food-producing machines humming. But even with these exemptions, the draft left the nation's farms and factories so short of personnel that new workers had to be found. An agreement with Mexico in 1942 brought thousands of Mexican agricultural workers, called bracerios, across the border to harvest the fruit and grain crops of the West. The Bracero program outlived the war by some 20 years, becoming a fixed feature of the agricultural economy in many Western states. So the Bracero program was very important because what this did was it brought in thousands of agricultural workers from Mexico to work some of the fruit and grain crops. The reason for this was because many of the farms and the factories were short of personnel because they would be going into the war. Even more dramatic was the march of women onto the factory floor. More than 6 million women took up jobs outside the home. Over half of them had never before worked for wages. Many of them were mothers, and the government was obliged to set up 3,000 daycare centers to care for Rosie the Riveter's children while she drilled the fuselage of a heavy bomber or joined the links of a tank track. When the war ended, Rosie and many of her sisters were in no hurry to put down their tools. They wanted to keep on working and often did. The war thus foreshadowed an eventual revolution in the roles of women in American society. So who was Rosie the Riveter? You're looking at the just the increase of women that were working in the factories during this time. Rosie the Riveter, they were mothers that would sorry, I take that. Yeah, I mean, some of them were mothers that would go into the factories. So with this in mind, you would also have daycare centers that needed to be created to ensure that these children also had jobs. Yet the war's immediate impact on women's lives has frequently been exaggerated. The great majority of American women, especially those with husbands present in the home or with small children to care for, did not work for wages in the wartime economy, but continued in their traditional roles. In Britain and the Soviet Union, far greater percentage of women, including mothers, were pressed into the industrial employment, as the gods of war laid a much heavier hand on those societies than they did on the United States. A poll in 1943 revealed that a majority of American women would not take a job in a war plant if it were offered. So what you understand is that this idea that the war changed the role of women permanently. This was extremely exaggerated. In fact, women in Great Britain and the Soviet Union actually played a more prominent role than women in the United States did. At war's end, two-thirds of women war workers left the labor force. Many of them were forced out of their jobs by employers and unions eager to reemploy returning servicemen. But half of them told census takers that they quit their jobs voluntarily because of family obligations. The immediate post-war period witnessed not a permanent widening of women's employment opportunities, but a widespread rush into suburban domesticity and mothering of the baby boomers, who were born by the tens of millions in the decade after 1945. America was destined to experience a thoroughgoing revolution of women's status later in the post-war period, but the epochal change was only beginning to gather momentum in the war years. So, all in all, the change will happen after the war, right? But two-thirds of women left the labor force after the war would end, so it shows a lack of change. Wartime migrations. How did the war impact the population at home? Who was Philip A. Randolph? What was he trying to organize in 1941? What was the purpose of the Fair Employment Commissions? And what impact did Native Americans have upon the war? Wartime migrations. Okay. The war also proved to be a demographic cauldron, churning and shifting the American population. Many of the 15 million men and women in uniform, having seen new sights and glimpsed new horizons, chose not to go home at war's end. War industries sucked people into boom towns like Los Angeles, Detroit, Seattle, and Baton Rouge. California's population grew by nearly 2 million. The South experienced especially dramatic changes. Franklin Roosevelt had called the South the nation's #1 economic problem in 1938. When war came, he seized the opportunity to accelerate the region's economic development. The states of the old Confederacy received a disproportionate share of defense contracts, nearly $6 billion federally financed industrial facilities. Here were the seeds of the post-war blossoming of the Sun Belt. So you're getting a lot of migration in the Sun Belt, more specifically the South, and as well as the West. You're getting industrial centers, factories to help with the wartime production that are being built there, right? And as you could see that in this graphic, which we'll talk in our Zoom session. Despite this economic stimulus in the South, some 1.6 million blacks left the land of their ancient enslavement to seek jobs in the war plants of the West and the North. Forever after, race relations constituted a national, not a regional issue. Explosive tensions developed over employment, housing, and segregated facilities. Black leader A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, threatened a massive Negro march on Washington in 1941 to demand equal opportunities for blacks in war jobs and in the armed forces. Roosevelt's response was to issue an executive order forbidding discrimination in defense industries. In addition, the president established the Fair Employment Practices Commission, the FEPC, to monitor compliance with this edict. Blacks were also drafted into armed forces, though they were still generally assigned to service branches rather than combat units, and subjected to petty degradations such as segregated blood banks for the wounded. But in general, the war helped to embolden blacks in their long struggle for equality. They rallied behind the slogan, Double V, victory over the dictators abroad and over racism at home. Membership in the NAACP, the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, shot up almost 500,000 mark. A new militant organization committed to nonviolent direct action. The Congress of Racial Equality was founded in 1942, which was called CORE. So you're looking at A. Philip Randolph, very important. You need to know who he is. He's the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Cars. He's trying to organize a massive march on Washington in 1941. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he cannot withstand a large march on Washington during this time because it is going to hinder the war effort. So his response is he establishes the Fair Employment Practices Commission, the FEPC. And what he's doing is he's forbidding discrimination in defense industries. And this commission is monitoring it to ensure that discrimination does not happen in the workplace in terms of the defense industries. African Americans were very upset regarding the just the inequality that existed, and also the racism and the prejudice, even in the um, military. Right, they were allowed to be part of the military, but they weren't necessarily part of combative units, and if they were still segregated. So the Double V campaign is something that you need to know. This means victory against the dictators, and as well as victory at home. Right, that if they go ahead and defeat the dictators, they could possibly earn more equality at home. The NAACP membership goes up, as well, so does CORE, which is going to be very important in terms of the civil rights movement. The northward migration of African Americans accelerated after the war, thanks to the advent of the mechanical cotton picker, an invention who impacted rival that of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Introduced in 1944, this new mechanical marvel did the work of 50 people at about one-eighth the cost. Overnight, the Cotton South's historic need for cheap labor disappeared. Their muscle no longer required in Dixie, with hopes for a better life in the North and West. Some 5 million black tenant farmers and sharecroppers left the South in 3 decades after the war. World War II brought about a second larger Great Migration than during World War I, comparable in the size to the immigrant floods from Ireland, Italy, and Poland. Within a single generation, a near majority of Africans gave up their historic homeland and their rural way of life. By 1970, half of all blacks lived outside the South, and urban had become almost a synonym for black. The speed and scale of these changes jolted the migrants and sometimes convulsed the communities that received them. This paragraph is saying that what you're getting is a massive immigration or migration of African Americans westward, as well as moving to urban centers, westward and north. The war also prompted an exodus of Native Americans from the reservations. Thousands of Indian men and women found work in the major cities, and thousands more answered Uncle Sam's call to arms. More than 90% of the Indians resided on reservations in 1940. 6 decades later, more than half lived in cities, with a large concentration in Southern California. This paragraph is saying that most Native Americans would actually start, not most, but a fair amount were actually starting to leave the reservations. Some 25,000 Native American men served in the armed forces. Comanches in Europe and Navajo Pacific made especially valuable contributions as code talkers. They transmitted radio messages in their native languages, which were incomprehensible to the Germans and the Japanese. So one of the contributions they had were the code talkers, and these were Native American who served in the military by transmitting radio messages that were not able to be deciphered by the Japanese and Germans. The sudden rubbing against one another of unfamiliar people produced some distressingly violent friction. In 1943, the young zoot suit-clad Mexican and Mexican Americans in Los Angeles were viciously attacked by Anglo sailors who cruised the streets in taxicabs searching for victims. Order was restored only after the Mexican ambassador made an emotional plea, pointing out that such outbreaks were grist for Nazi propaganda mills. At almost the same time, an even more brutal race killed 25 blacks and 9 whites that erupted in Detroit. So you understand through this paragraph that although that you're getting migration, and you're also getting a lot of contributions done by minority groups and people of color that are not necessarily accepted in society. And this is society, and this is evident through the Zoot Suit riots, as well as also the race riots in Detroit. How did the war impact the population at home? I went over this. Of course, you're getting a lot of migrations because you need jobs that had to be filled as a result of men going over to war. I went over who Philip A. Randolph was. Of course, he was a president of the what was it called? The train cab, right? Sorry, guys. Let me double check here. About the train cab. Prominent African American leader that, there we go, Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, right? And he would go ahead and try to organize a march on Washington. And of course, FDR does not want a large march on Washington. His influence would go ahead and create the Fair Employment Commission, right, which ensured that discrimination would not take place in the defense industry. The Native Americans played a major role as they were code talkers. They were able to send messages without the Japanese and the Germans deciphering them. Holding the home front. Yep. How did World War II usher in the idea of big government interventionism? Despite these ugly episodes, American on the home front suffered little from the war compared to the people of the other fighting nations. By the war's end, much of the planet was a smoking ruin. But in America, the war invigorated the economy and lifted the country out of a decade-long depression. The gross national product vaulted from less than 100 billion in 1940 to more than 200 billion in 1945. Corporate profits rose from the 6 billion in 1940 to almost twice that amount 4 years later. If you were going to try to go to war in a capitalist country, said Secretary of War Henry Stimson, you have to let business make money out of the process, or business won't work. Despite wage ceilings, overtime pay fattened pay envelopes. Disposable personal income, even after payment of wartime taxes, more than doubled. On December 7, 1944, the third anniversary of Pearl Harbor, Macy's department store rang up the biggest sales day in its history. Americans never had it so good, and they wanted it a lot better. When price controls were finally lifted in 1946, America's pent-up lust to consume pushed prices up 33% in less than 2 years. The rest of the world, meanwhile, was still clawing its way out of from under the rubble of war. So all in all, American business is thriving. People are working a lot of overtime in the factories, so they're getting big paychecks. Once the price regulations are taken out in 1946, 33% increase in prices as a result of the supply and demand. The hand of the government touched more American lives intimately during the war than ever before. The war, perhaps even more than a New Deal, pointed the way to post-1945 era big government interventionism. Every household felt the constraints of the rationing system. Millions of men and women worked for Uncle Sam in the armed forces. Millions more worked for him in defense industries, where their employees or employers and unions, monitored by the FEPC and NWLB, and their personal needs were cared for by government-sponsored housing projects, daycare facilities, and health plans. The Office of Scientific Research and Development channeled hundreds of millions of dollars into university-based scientific research, establishing a partnership between the government and universities that underwrote America's technological and economic leadership in the post-war era. The flood of war dollars, not the relatively modest regulative New Deal spending, at last swept the plague out of employment from the land. War, not enlightened social policy, cured the depression. As the post-war economy continued to depend dangerously on military spending for its health, many observers look back in the years 1941 as the origins of a warfare welfare state. So all in all, what you're getting here is that the government very much was intervening in the lives of people, whether it's price regulations, whether it's giving them jobs, whether it's rationing. And this actually helped the unemployment rate go down, which in turn was able to get us out of the Great Depression. The conflict was phenomenally expensive. The conflict was phenomenally expensive. The wartime bill amounted to more than $330 billion, 10 times the direct cost of World War One, twice as much all previous federal spending since 1776. Roosevelt would have preferred to follow pay-as-you-go policy to finance the war, but the costs were simply too gigantic. The income tax net was expanded to catch up about 4 times as many people as before. Maximum tax rates rose as high as 90%. But despite such drastic measures, only about 2/5 of the war costs were paid from current revenues. The remainder were borrowed. National debt skyrocketed, $49 billion in 1941 to $259 billion in 1945. When production finally slipped into high gear, the war was costing $10 million an hour. That was the price of victory over such implacable enemies. So a lot of this money had to be borrowed, right, in order to, So you're looking at the growing national debt. How did World War II usher the idea of big government interventionism? I mean, it definitely did. What this question is asking is, to what extent did the government intervene in the lives of everyday people? It did. You're looking at rationing, price controls, wage regulations, legalization of strikes, right? The government was controlling the lives of people consistently. The rising sun in the Pacific. Describe the U.S. involvement in each of the following Pacific battles: Philippines, Coral Sea, and Midway.